thank you everybody for attending. It's great to have you here today. And so what I wanted to talk about was innovating and measuring ROI for the enterprise. And we're going to talk about this in the context of generative AI. So what will we be talking about? We'll talk about some of the generative AI concepts, but more importantly, we'll be discussing measuring tangible ROI with these techniques. And I'll go through some of the different implementation strategies that we've been using and some that you may want to think about within your organization as well. And then we'll get into some real world examples of things that we've done. So this could be an opportunity for you to really just understand the sort of the art of practicality as you think about how you're going to implement strategies that do include ROI. And then we'll talk about implementation for success. And so that kind of rounds it out. So it should be an interesting conversation. Certainly would love to get your thoughts on what we talk about today. So who am I? I am Insight's Chief Data Officer in North America, also a distinguished engineer, and I manage our portfolio around data and AI. So these strategies are really right in my wheelhouse. I also teach at Northeastern University, and I teach about these topic areas as well. So really near and dear to my heart are these kinds of topics, and certainly love to share my knowledge with you all today during our session. So let's get going. First, we'll talk about generative AI, and I like to call it the state of play. So basically what's going on in the industry, and we're all very familiar with the hype, of course, but what I'm starting to see now is the fact that we're moving more toward practical application. So we can talk about all of the interesting things that might be happening in terms of, taking our jobs and doing them for us, or maybe looking at, people are calling it, general AI, or we'll call it the singularity. But I think we're quite a ways away from something like that. But there are very practical use cases that we should be thinking about. And I like to use the term productionalization as we think about maybe how do we apply all of this in the general sense. And in order to apply it, we need to make sure that when we make the investments in these kinds of capabilities, we know exactly what we're doing. So in general, I like to think about setting goals and identifying expectations, and that will really help us in this ROI discussion. So the business typically is the first piece we think about, or the business use case. So first identify the outcome, and I'm really just talking to this graphic here. So identify what is the expected outcome so that we can start to see what are the things that we would want to objectively quantify so that we can tell if we're going through a generative AI solution, did we hit our goals or not? The next thing to think about is what is the ability of generative AI to be able to effectively accomplish our goal. So it may not always be the right solution for a particular problem that you might have. So you also need to think about that a little bit clearly. We are kind of thinking today about generative AI as being a panacea, solves all problems for all people. Well, that's not necessarily true. We need to really think about what are some of the capabilities that we might want to leverage in order to be able to get there. Then determining the appropriate level of automation that we might want to include. You've probably heard the term real-time feedback with through human intervention. And really, this is the important concept. So at what point do you sort of automate everything and the decision-making processes can be done by the generative AI solutions or integrated with your applications? Or how much human involvement do you really want? And so these are the kinds of things that we think about here. How much automation do you want to include or need to include in order to achieve the objective? And this really has to do with the outcome. And then finally, ensuring that the ethical considerations are met in the general sense. And so this is really, thinking about security, thinking about, PII, if you're within a healthcare medical industry, thinking about PHI or healthcare information. And so these are really important strategies and considerations, sort of where we are today. Security and privacy is becoming a big area of concern for us now because we're starting to use our own data as part of these solutions. So how do we leverage our own data, but also how do we protect it? And so these kinds of concepts are really important to us. So is the data trusted that we might be using for embedding purposes as we think about the solutions using generative AI? Encryption, always important for data protection. Transparency, so ensuring that if we are using particular data, and these are things that we've done in the past as well with standard applications and data access, but we want to make sure that we are clear on what data we're using and for what purposes. And then practicing responsible AI use. So what purposes are we using it for? And if there are things that might say have an ethical consideration framework in place, do we understand that and can we communicate that and understand where we sort of fit within the realm of, is it ethical according to the way that we think about using someone's data or data that might be available to us? Clearly, there are benefits as we think about it. So increased efficiency and productivity, improved accuracy across the board, debate based on the type of solution. So again, identifying the right outcome, we can save from a productivity perspective. There's cost savings, efficiency, as I mentioned earlier. And then there's a huge benefit around human-like interactivity. So chatting was the thing that we were first introduced to, and now it goes broader than that. So it's more of the, how can we make this a better customer experience across the board for our customers or even our employees? And so these are things to really think about in terms of benefits. And then we already talked about some of the challenges around security and privacy, but also bias is a big one, trust, and then also challenges around things like how to use the environment or prompt engineering. So that's kind of the state of play. I'm not going to cover all of those topic areas. Some of these we've talked about before, but today I wanted to talk about ROI. And so let's just sort of focus in on some of that. The use cases that we typically would think about in the grand scheme of things are related to things like modern workplace, where we're using co-pilots to help us create efficiencies and productivity within the context of using our sort of workplace solutions, like Office, for example, or even coding environments in order to be able to become more productive. And then prompt engineering is the thing I already talked about in terms of like, how can we become better at being able to use these environments to increase our productivity? And so, some of the things that we've seen is the fact that generative design AI will automate 60% of the designing effort over time. And I agree with that. And I think that that's true. And it's going to take some time, of course, but what's really important is understanding prompt engineering and how we leverage these capabilities to be able to produce the kinds of results we're expecting. Goes back to that chart I was just describing. And then how do we integrate it into our applications? And this gets to the automation side of the house. So, we can then start to assume that we can build intelligence into our applications by using the generative concepts. And then we think about these, and the term I like to use is AI-enabled applications. But there are some considerations, of course, that we need to take into play, which are security, for example, custom integration, complexity, or even making sure that we can measure the responses that are what we expect them to be. And if they're not, then we need to think about strategies for improving them. So these are the kinds of things that we think about in the integrated environment. And, by 2025, for example, Gartner's sources here talking about 30% of enterprises will have implemented AI augmented development and testing strategies. So this is basically, 25% jump from 2021 just over the course of time. And yes, some of that is impacted by generative AI and the abilities there. And then custom modeling, of course, is another area where, if you think about the current capabilities, our models today are, think about OpenAI's solution, just as one example. They're trained on a large corpus of information, primarily gathered from the internet. So it really doesn't know anything about your particular use case, which is why we talk about things like model embedding or prompt engineering, et cetera, because of the fact that we need to provide our own context or our own information. So you may actually see the case where you want to create your own models. So you might say, I need to create a model that knows all about real estate or whatever healthcare, depending on your particular use case. So you may want to create your own or tune a model that knows your particular use case really effectively. So this is I think we'll see this evolution over time. So the role of design strategists are basically now going to become a blend of current roles of a designer and a developer. And then, like I said, being able to understand, when do I create my own model versus when do I just augment my model with the knowledge that I have today? And these are some of the areas where we focus. Now, all of that in the context of ROI. which is the important part of this. So we can think about all of the use cases, for example. And if I start on the left-hand side of this, and I'll move from value creation to value realization, but value creation now is really just thinking about the art of the possible. So what are the kinds of things? And remember, I talked earlier about identifying what is the expected outcome. So you have the ability when you start this process to be able to say, well, what do I want to get out of this? What is the expected outcome? And then think about the qualitative, quantitative metrics that you might use in order to be able to identify what is the value that can be provided. So it's sort of if I want to improve operational efficiency, identify what that means to you. So create metrics that are able to sort of quantify the measurement of those kinds of operational efficiencies. You might say, well, we're moving our manufacturing process from 10 days to 2 days. Okay, well, that's measurable. So that helps you to be able to understand what this really means. And I talked about the other characteristics of it. So in the first part of this, in the upper left, we're talking about what are the metrics that can measure the areas that I described earlier, whether they're just financial goals, competitive advantage, or operational efficiencies. How do I articulate what the expected outcome might be? Now, this is really just the beginning part of it. We haven't quite yet realized any value, but we're just defining what value is or what it can be. Then we can start the exploration process. And then if you think about the context of how do I start the generative AI lifecycle, which is another thing that I like to talk about, but you engage with the original set of expectations, but then you think about, well, what's the use case as it relates to generative AI? And you can walk through a process that helps you to identify how can I realize that value or progress toward realizing value by assessing, identifying, validating technology and the techniques that you might be using to be able to create value within the organization. And that's another important part of this. So this is the process that we follow, and I'll talk about this in a little while. Super important because now we're sort of setting the stage again. So we're saying, how do we set the stage for eventual value realization? And this is where we start to say, okay, now I've actually exceeded those goals or hit those goals, and I was able to, in the case of financial goals, save X amount of dollars, for example. So these are important characteristics of it because it's sort of the set a goal, measure to the goal, and then you really iterate on that process. And that is really the ROI cycle. Next, we'll think about the AI value enablers. So what are some of the things that would enable us to be able to effectively create value? And number one is our data assets. And so this is, the fact that I'm a chief data officer means that, of course, I'm very interested in data, but in the practical sense, data is really critical to all of this. So if you think, how am I training my AI, or how is the AI being used to be able to provide value to my business? Well, it's happening through the context of quality data that really represents your business, data that really understands or can represent the kinds of things and activities that you perform within the organization, and it learns from those kinds of things in order to be able to eventually get us to value realization. So your data AI strategy is critical here. That's an enabler. The AI portfolio, the things that you may create within the organization that helps you to be able to foster these kinds of capabilities, are also critical. And data assets, as I mentioned earlier, your resource talent that you might have, the culture that is supporting this, and of course, technology. We're talking about large language models, but it doesn't just stop there. It's also related to general AI. And I hate to use the term general AI because I think it's, no matter which type of AI we're talking about, it's still it really is all innovative concepts. But I guess today, like machine learning algorithms or sort of historical I'll call it legacy machine learning kinds of models and AI techniques now feel like they're dated because of the fact that Gen AI has sort of come onto the stage here and become such a prolific mechanism to be able to understand how to create value within an organization. But it doesn't mean that ML is not overly valuable. It just means that there's specific purpose for which we would use, I'll call it classical techniques versus Gen AI techniques. So then we move into, once we identified all of this sort of value creation, we can now then move into the value story. So how do we moved from the fact that we've identified opportunities for value to the point where we can start to realize that value. Now, many organizations, and I've seen this over the course of my career, where organizations you'll have data science teams, you'll have a number of projects that you might have created. We're creating prototypes of how we can, say, use AI techniques to be able to have a business impact. But we never really take it any further. So we said, oh, it's really wonderful. We've created these proof of concepts or prototypes, and they show us value. But we never realized that value because we never really quite made it to the value story part. So when we get here, we want to say, well, how do we move from this concept of really cool idea, this is, feels like it's going to have an impact on the business, to the actual realization? And so this is really the value story proposition. Now, the techniques that I've been describing allow us to be able to do that more effectively because we've already set the metrics and measures that we want to use in order to get there. So we said we are going after financial goals. So we want to, save X amount of dollars per year, per month, whatever it might be, or percentages, etc. So those are really, we're already defining the part of the story as we go. So I think that's a really good place to start. So, but here we now move into, if this, we've explored, we've done our enablement models, or at least we identified the characteristics of enablement. Now we can move into the value story proposition, and that really helps us transition into the value realization story. So this is the give get. So what kinds of things am I going to do? And now what am I going to get from it? That's what moves us into value realization. So in general, so that we just kind of follow this through. What are the benefits to the organization? Okay, so these should be similar to those metrics. So we can access capital or higher valuation potentially. So, but this is the impact or reflective across the organization. So the things that I was able to do in terms of value creation can now be realized as, capital improvement, for example, or higher valuations, the stock market, et cetera, or customer acquisitions and retention. So again, measurements of not so much of the creation of the value in this particular case, but this is sort of the external representation of what did it really mean? How did I realize that value? Well, I realized it through acquiring more customers, or maybe now I'm compliant, or maybe I have better employee engagement. And these are not all of them, but these give you some idea in terms of what are the reflective benefits to the organization. Now that's all great as well. So now we can start to see the impact as we look at the benefits to the organization. We move into this exploitation phase. And so exploitation is really sort of the opposite of exploration. In exploration, we're trying to figure out, like, what kinds of things will work. Now, when we get to this point, we're saying, well, we know the things that are working. How do we exploit them? So how do we leverage the value we've created, and how do we grow it, optimize it, reinforce it, so that we can, say, produce or exploit that at scale? So now we can say the organization is growing, we're acquiring new customers, we're able to optimize our workflow techniques or automation in order to be able to increase or decrease our overhead costs, for example. So these are really, that's an important part of this. And you can see here now, if you follow this kind of process and you say, this is all based off of generative AI techniques, well, all of a sudden now, this is our value creation, value proposition cycle, and this is how you realize value from AI. So you really look at it from this perspective. Now, this technique is not new, but when you apply it to the way that we think about AI, we move it from, the lab, if you will, on the left-hand side, to practical application on the right-hand side, and we see the value from it. And then, of course, from the stakeholders, where we would have started the creating the priorities and goals initially, is really just the stakeholders now also see the benefit through creating now innovation or evolving into thinking about new ways in order to be able to create impactful kinds of solutions by leveraging these data assets we've been talking about, or growing and sustaining, depending on what the expectations are from the stakeholders. So this is really the key to all of it. And it's important for us to understand how this works, and which is why I spent some time just describing what it is, because this is really how we want to think about our generative AI solutions, and then how to really measure the impact, as opposed to just saying, oh, I've got some generative AI techniques, or I've created some cool use cases, but you may end up in a situation where you're like, I've invested a lot of time and effort and money into producing it, but I never really saw the realization of that value. You really want to think about that and how to move into that kind of an environment. Now, there are some other things that go into play. One of the things that I won't really talk about too much, but we can also, talk about at some point in the future is how do I productionalize this environment? So when I get into the value realization side of this house, I really do want to think about how can I productionalize this? How can I monitor it? How can I ensure that I'm hitting those expectations? Um, because that is a process as well. And it's what I like to call the life cycle of these generative AI solutions. So operationalization also becomes a big part of this value realization concept. But in general, how does this work? So can we do some of these things? So you might ask me, where do you start? Well, let's just do some napkin math in terms of how this works. So if I'm trying to understand how to become more productive, operationally effective, before GPT, just again, this is just a simple example. Well, I might have to say, if I'm trying to solve a particular problem, I might have to do all of this manually. And so in this case, for example, I'm trying to figure out how to sell more bicycles, for example, within a particular area. So if I'm the person that's actually responsible for that, then I might need to say, go reach out to any store location and understand some of the supporting data that they might have available to them in order to even begin my process. So I'm going to have to read any documentation that they might have, who's using it, maybe case studies, collaborate with the marketing teams to maybe draft some emails to try to create a promotional campaign to increase the sales, for example, and then write and test maybe HTML response emails so that I can understand how this is really going to work in the grand scheme of things. So just doing those things, and this is really a simple example, but also a very practical example of how you can use generative AI. This can take a decent amount of time. So it could take up 3 weeks, for example, to do all of that. And think about some of the manual processes that are associated with this. Now, if we start moving into a GPT world or into a generative AI world, we can think about maybe doing this more effectively. So if we have access to the information, and remember, go back to the enablers that I was talking about before. If the data assets are available to me, I can then use them as part of my generative AI solution to basically just make a query against the environment and then say, well, what products are in the store? That could take a minute or less. Um, are the bikes better for beginner or advanced, for example? These kinds of concepts, maybe a couple minutes. Write the emails. Well, it's a code generator too. It allows us to be able to generate code, and you can generate HTML super effectively. So these processes now go from days or weeks down to minutes or hours. And so you can see the clear improvement just in terms of manual effort. And so that equates to dollars. And you can really think about it. If you think about how many people are doing this kind of activity within your organization, now all of a sudden you can see huge return on investment. And that's really part of the ROI. This is how you move from the conceptual value creation model to the value realization model. And of course, we know that there are tons of use cases. And I spend so much time talking to customers about the art of the possible. And I described that in one of the earlier slides about how do we think about what is possible or what is likely to be a good area of investment. Well, a lot of it has to do with really understanding stakeholders and the business outcomes before you start. And so it could be in retail, for example, demand forecasting, easy one. Manufacturing, parts delivery, for example, maybe even supply chain analysis, or even line quality control, even using different types of characteristics of techniques like computer vision, for example. It could get involved here, or even really understanding or elevating our ability to understand what is possible based off of collecting all that information to a central location, and then really just understanding how to leverage those assets to be able to create solutions which allow us to become more operationally efficient. Healthcare, life science, etc. So basically, labor optimization is always a big one. So ensuring you can increase productivity by eliminating manual processes, as I described earlier. So any of these things where you have to collect your own information to be able to achieve your particular objective, those kinds of things can be easily automated through these these types of techniques. I won't read them all to you, but in general, you get the idea in terms of these are the kinds of things that we can do. And with just about any customer I talk to, they've got dozens of use cases that they might have already identified. So the next thing that I do after we end up talking to customers about like what are some of these use cases, I can now move into this concept of the ROI, value realization. Let's talk about it now in the context of value creation, value realization, to be able to understand, is it worth the investment to be able to get there? So do I have clear line of sight into value realization? Or maybe I need to do a little bit more work to understand what kind of value am I going to get out of this? And you can do that by use case in these particular cases. And that's exactly what we do. So let's just talk about a few examples. So here we can think about transforming healthcare through digital innovation. These kinds of things really are focused on, again, setting the stage. What are the things that we want to look to do? So if we want to reduce patient length of stay, for example, that's something that's very measurable. We can identify those metrics. We can optimize the clinical workforce. Again, this is productivity enhancement within the clinical workforce to improve any care coordination. So consistency, but also time to care or time to appropriate care is really important. And so we can use real-time environments or reduce the amount of time that it takes to get an answer or to be able to provide service. And so we were able to get to the point where we could improve the prediction of patient load out to a week at a time, 98% accurate in terms of accuracy. Current accuracy rates, are half of that. So you are getting to the point where it requires manual creation, but also an analysis now to a consistent approach, which is double the efficacy. The length of stay reduced by a day and a half, for example, which we know within that world, the amount of time that you spend in the hospital is significant cost to the hospital network. And it also means that then that they can, there's overload in terms of doctor, nurse, work effort, because the longer you stay, the more complexity that you clearly you create for the doctors and nurses, because it's not an infinite capacity. You basically then have to say the longer you stay, the more people are in the hospital, the harder it becomes to provide level of quality service. And then in this case, millions were saved per year across this particular one. So the value realization becomes millions of dollars that are saved per year. And also the thing that we didn't measure, but I do know was part of this, having worked on this particular project, was that nurses and doctors actually have better experience because now their jobs become easier because they can leverage these systems and allows them to be able to have a better satisfaction as it relates to the execution of their own jobs. And that's usually a metric that sometimes is missed, although I encourage customers to really think about that too, even though I wouldn't say it's a hidden metric, but it clearly is an important one. Okay, so again, another case study here where we just talked about how do you enable scientific discoveries to benefit global health, another medical style situation, but here let's just think about what was the challenge. So again, starting in that what's the stakeholder desire or objectives they're looking to do, build an intuitive data sharing platform to provide researchers access to complicated clinical trial data. This one's important from the perspective of the ability to know what's in there. So basically, the first thing you do is you have to think about collection of data, but also being able to articulate or query the environment to know, well, what data is in there and what do I need? And if you think about putting a generative AI front end on top of it, you can do what if analysis, questions, or I like to use the concept of chatting with your data. So you can chat with your data. You can find information that you might need in order to be able to perform an analysis of your own. Or in this case, you might say, let's just say you're doing a clinical trial study. You may want to think about, well, what's a cohort group that I could use, or what are the characteristics of that cohort group for a lab study, for example. So anytime that we think about patient information, though, we have to get into security. Protocols that are around HIPAA that need to be enforced. We talked earlier about sort of securitization of data and privacy. So this is another key part of this, is to implement those solutions, also increasing the user experience and manageability of the environment. So, but the important part about this, measuring the outcomes. So 6,700 plus clinical trials contributed, and growing. So basically collecting a corpus of information to be able to leverage. Growth, basically user growth in over the course of 4 years in terms of who uses it and why. Why is this an important metric? Because of the fact that the researchers or the consumers of this information now see this as valuable, a valuable source of knowledge that they can use in order to be able to complete their clinical trials or to identify cohorts that they might want to use. So those metrics are very measurable, and they also provide us with value, again, as we think about realizing that value. So increasing those numbers means that people are using it, which is the value realization proposition. Because what happened beforehand was that you did this by hand, or in order to do this research, you'd have clinicians or researchers that would have teams of people that would go and collect this information, very much like the napkin math I was describing earlier. So another example, maybe outside of the healthcare arena, is what are some of the things that we're talking here about? AI recommendation system for engine, which are for manufacturer of engines. That is, so what's the concept here? So basically, 100,000 different complex and custom components. They basically have human processes mostly, which could delay any sales life cycles and creating missed opportunities. So manual processes, again, key things to look for. And you need technical designers to identify components or make recommendations for compatible parts for those that maybe weren't in existence. So you might say, I'm either going to stop the process to find the components that I need to complete, or I'm going to use alternatives that maybe meet the same specifications, or maybe recommendations that if they're not already pre-identified, how can you extrapolate into these parts may have the same characteristics that could allow you to be able to continue to move forward in terms of the manufacturing process. So you'll notice the other thing here is that probably a common theme is data, as I was talking about before. So, and this used the technique that I was describing earlier. So we start with proof of concept. So basically, let's think about how to create value first by using things like a proof of concept. So here we're building ML models to be able to visualize and understand what some of the value may be before we even get to the realization point, and then testing and development, and sort of move this into a more mature process. And then our outcomes, measurability. So after 8 weeks, we increased pipeline revenue by $15 million and then projected annual value of $50 million. So this becomes now clearly this value realization is very high in this particular kind of a solution. So these are the kinds of things that we not only look for, but the things that we want to make sure that we leverage as we move forward with these kinds of solution. So the way that we do this is, especially in the generative AI, but in general, this is how we think about moving on these kinds of projects around value realization. So we talk about alignment, acceleration, enterprise transformation, and this is actually following the same strategy that I talked about before. So the value creation down at the bottom, value realization as well. So we progress from creation to realization, and instead of the sort of cyclical feedback loop, this is more linear. But in general, this talks about you start with alignment. Alignment is really about using getting your head around what are the stakeholders looking to do? What's the expected business outcome? How will technology enable you to be able to help to solve these problems? And then what is the appropriate technology in the AI space that can support this? Not everything's a panacea. So think about, well, what's the appropriate use cases that we might want to put into play? So we do things like briefings and workshops that allow us to be able to do that effectively. So we can engage to help to identify the beginning part of that ROI cycle. From there, we move into this concept of acceleration. So how can I show value quickly? I'm not talking about full exploitation or realization because we're not quite at the enterprise level, but how do I know that the investments that I'm making are realistic and they will provide us with the kind of value that we might be looking for when we talked about it in the workshop, for example. So we want to say we really see potential for a large impact, but we don't know that this necessarily is going to be the right solution. So let's test it out. I hate to use the word test it out, but let's really talk about how can we get to identification of what is the potential for value quickly, so we know that we're making the right types of investments. So we have accelerators that allow us to move fast, to be able to take a use case and to implement it quickly. These can happen in a couple weeks. We can actually move further into more complicated ones, and we'll do 2 to 4 or 5 weeks in to be able to build more customized versions of this, which allow you to be able to, again, develop confidence and trust in the solution that you might be looking for. And then from there now, so we're sort of hitting that pivot point where we're saying, now that we really understand the potential for value, or we've created a scenario for value, now we want to move into the value realization. So now here we get into broad-based implementation strategies. We start to think about how to realize some of that value as we move forward. We've deployed this into our production environments. We know how to take advantage of this by using things like custom app integration or data services that allow us to improve the quality of our data so that the generative AI solutions now work more effectively and they address specifically the kinds of outcomes that you're expecting. And then beyond that is this gets into the operational characteristics of it. And again, part of the value realization cycle or exploitation, if you want to call it that. But in general, these are how do we keep the operational efficiencies that we've identified or the competitive advantage capabilities we've been able to deploy? How do we ensure that we can continue to realize value from that consistently? And that's through things like governance and management. So what are these ongoing agile application development environments or constant improvement feedback loops that we can use in order to ensure that we can continue to see benefit coming from the AI solutions that we've created? And this is the kind of thing on the far right where we think, okay, well, this isn't necessarily the kinds of things where we've been able to move this in the AI world. I saw many customers get stuck before they even get to the enterprise deployment, which is this enterprise-wide transformation, and they never really make it to this governance model. So it's not really infused into the organization. So this is why we want to look at it from the perspective of this ROI capability that I've been describing, so that not only is it sort of an interesting science project, it now becomes a true value or value generator for the organization. That's where we want to get to, and this is the idea in order to be able to get there. So we've actually worked on this quite a bit, and certainly, being able to integrate these different components together allows you to be able to look at it from I'll call it a full-up solution perspective. So it's not just the data, it's not just the AI algorithm, it's not just the AI implementation of generative AI or the neural network, it's not just the information that you might be embedding or the knowledge you're embedding into your solution. It's a cross section of all of these capabilities. It is the artificial intelligence, it's the modern data platform, it's the leveraging the reporting capabilities, it's allowing you to be able to then move into as well the integrated into applications. So when you bring all of these together, it allows you to then be able to create a solution where you can move from value creation to realization effectively and then govern it to be able to continue to see value from that solution. So what do we do at Insight here? So of course, I'm talking about it. So, and these strategies are really just, they're reflective of the kinds of engagements that we have worked on and the kinds of engagements that we want to engage with you within the organization in order to be able to accelerate your ability to realize value, to be able to create competitive advantage. And so that's what it's really all about. So within the AI environment, we have complete data and AI expertise. So we can do the AI, the BI, the modern data platform, et cetera. So we can basically address, and this is part of my portfolio, is how to address all of those things that I've been talking about. So can we help you to create solutions which enable you to be able to see that value within your data sets, but also to change the business model. We're also a full solutions integrator. So we work across a number of different categorical areas. So if it is broader, and I was just describing this, the solution is typically more than just a data solution or an AI solution. You have to integrate it into your modern workplace, your office solutions, or your applications, et cetera. So there are different components of this that really become important for the solution, because the solution is just not one particular area. It's a combination of these areas of expertise, as I like to call them, for integrating things like cybersecurity, for example, or managed cloud services. So bringing it all together creates the full solution that allows you to be able to succeed as an organization. And then I talked about this already. So the accelerators, but all they really are is they give you the ability to move fast. So we've worked to create these accelerators to not create custom solutions every time, but it's more, let's let's create solution accelerators that allow us to move fast for things like, we can create, say, the lens for Gen AI is a good example of this. So we can get you up and running with lens for Gen AI, or being able to chat within your organization to your, whether it's a local version of OpenAI that's running in your Microsoft tenant, or potentially another type of large language model that you might want to integrate to. But basically, we can get you up and running with a web application that allows you to be able to set security controls, to be able to monitor who's using it, et cetera, that talks to any large language model that you might want to run in your private tenant. So you can get up and running fast on it. You don't have to write your own, you don't have to create your own APIs, et cetera. So that's the idea, is get you up and running fast and then move it forward into the enterprise. Those kinds of things are really important in terms of allowing us to be able to move fast. And that's the idea of the accelerator. Okay, so, and if you are interested in these kinds of things, and if you're interested in sort of taking that step, I really encourage you to scan the QR code, get in touch with us. We'd love to be able to help you to be able to realize your own vision within your organization, and certainly take advantage of the skills and examples that we've been able to provide to be able to get there faster.